Okay, at 6:30, we'll call the June Sawyer County Board of Supervisors meeting to order, please. Carol, may we have roll call?
Dale Schleter. Here. Jesse Betcher. Tweed Schumann.
Here.
Troy Morgan. Here. James Schlender. Here. Mark Hilwig. Here. Thomas Duffy. Here. Bruce Paulson. Here. Susie Taylor. Chuck Van Etten.
Here.
He's by phone. Dale Olson. Here. Don Pettit. Here. Ron Kinsley. Ron Buckles.
Present.
Helen Dennis.
Thank you, Carol. Let the record indicate we have a quorum. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Carol, certification of compliance with open meetings law, please.
This meeting has been noticed to the members of this board, to the public, and to the news media as required by section 19.84 of the Wisconsin statutes.
Thank you, Carol. The meeting agenda has been presented. We'll move on to number 5, public comment. Is there anyone here who would like to address the board at this time? Please step forward and state your name.
Linda Zilmer, Edgewater property owner. Wanted to make a few comments, partially to follow up from last month public comment and to add again this month. I appreciate some of the conversations that have gone on from our judge and from one of our county supervisors when they talk about constitutional rights and due process. I expect due process through our local government and our county government as well. So last month, coming out of the Finance Committee, one thing that didn't come to the full county board that I felt all supervisors should address was the opportunity to delay without penalty or interest property taxes, the second installment, and I don't see that tonight. Another concern I have coming out of the Finance Committee from this month is what was noticed on last week's agenda was to talk about this referendum. And rather than a referendum discussion and this debt possibility coming before you, there's only a debt resolution. And I cannot see how that is responsible financial management. And I would hope that there would be more discussion and there wouldn't be action tonight and that the whole county board could talk about that. The other item that I raised last month was rushing to act on a rezone at the county board level to approve it when it had only been heard by the zoning committee the Friday before. Minutes from that zoning committee had not been even published, and there was discussion between Corporation Counsel and prior zoning administrator, and that's the issue that they brought up, while a valid one, was not the one that I was raising. I was raising a question about adjoining property owners have 24-hour notice before this county board meeting to be able to protest an action. And so that was not allowed due to the fact that there were no minutes, and the way that that agenda item was added at the last minute, there's no way that anyone could have protested in 24 hours. Coming up to the, again, along the zoning lines, with item number 14, the Land, Water, and Forest Resource Committee item on the waste storage ordinance, that's truly a manure storage ordinance, and manure is what is defined in that ordinance, and waste is not. But I again object that that item showed as new business or other business on the zoning committee and was not noticed as a public hearing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Karen Meliseka with Namaquagan Transit. Just wanted to give a brief update that since the governor had deemed us essential a couple months ago, we've stayed open all along. We have not closed at all. However, ridership took a big dip because there was no place to go. But now it has started picking up just a little bit. It's started growing back because there are some employers that are open and such. And just to let you know, we've been working, our drivers are doing great. We have masks, we have shields, we have gloves, we have a gazillion wipes, alcohol wipes. We're constantly wiping our seats down, everything. We also have our ozone generators, which we run every night, and that also cleans the air and bacteria and viruses as well. And we have aerosol sprays that we are running intermittently as well. So just wanted to keep you posted that we are still out there. We're getting people where they need to go, and we are still running to all our normal routes as normal. So just want to give you an update. Thank you.
All right. Is there anyone else for public comment that would like to approach the board? Okay, if not, then we'll move on to number 6, minutes from our previous meeting, County Board, May 21st, 2020. Mr. Helwig.
Motion to approve. Second.
Mr. Duffy, I got a motion by Mr. Helwig, second by Mr. Duffy, to approve the county board minutes as presented. Is there any further discussion? If none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Okay, number 7, Sheriff Marotic.
With the passing of Deputy Richard Welch Jr., I just want to mention he was a member of the Sawyer County Sheriff's Office for over 11 years, serving as a dispatcher, a jailer, and a programs officer. Deputy Welch loved to serve, whether for his family, as a deputy, or for our community, or for Christ. He was a compassionate, caring, generous man who was always there for everyone, especially the people he worked with. He always offered help, and no matter how busy he was, when asked to help, he never said no. He was a father figure in our agency, a mentor, and a leader with great work ethic. Deputy Welch was our programs officer for the past year, and what a commitment he had to making a difference. He touched so many people and was respected by everyone, even the inmates. He was the right person for that job. Dick leaves us with a huge void and will be forever missed. I also just want to take a moment for the rest of
Let's just take a moment of silence for Mr. Welch, please. Okay, thank you. Mr. Marotic?
Thank you. I'd like to take a moment and talk about with the civil unrest that we're dealing with across the country. I'm compelled to speak about the effects, the ongoing effects it has with our own law enforcement in our community. As we know, it's our constitutional right to assemble, demonstrate, and protest, but the behavior that's going on, the criminal behavior, the burning of buildings, damaging of property, jeopardizing safety of others is unacceptable. I will never condone wrong behavior by anyone, especially those of us in law enforcement who are expected to be professionals and live to that higher standard. Our Sawyer County law enforcement believe in the code of ethics. I feel that it is wrong for some to paint all law enforcement with the same paintbrush. When law enforcement receives that critical call for service, law enforcement is expected to make that split-second decision based on our training and experience. That split-second decision will be analyzed by many for months and years afterwards. I want to make it clear as sheriff, I stand behind our men and women serving in law enforcement in all of Sawyer County, all 4 law enforcement agencies. Today, the use of force is questioned across the country. I want to reiterate the fact that all of our law enforcement officers are state certified law enforcement officers through the Wisconsin Department of Justice Training and Standards. That includes an academy that has some extensive training in the use of force. Wisconsin has a defensive arrest and defensive arrest and tactics system that is recognized across the country as one of the best and adopted by many states. Our agency and the other 3 agencies in Sawyer County and law enforcement have had some strenuous and interesting times, especially with the start of COVID. We had a brutal homicide on Memorial Weekend. We've had 4 traffic fatalities since January 1st. The average of Sawyer County is usually 2 for the year. We've had a spike in drug and alcohol use and a rise in domestic calls. Our law enforcement officers live here and are a part of our community. They are committed in keeping our community safe. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Okay, moving on to number 8. Proclamation honoring the life and efforts of Mike Sanchez. Mr. Schlender.
What's the rule on the masks?
You have to wear a mask in a setting like this.
All right. The following is a proclamation and resolution that has come in that is being presented from the Public Safety Committee. It is in recognition of Michael Sanchez, and for the record, I'm going to read it into the record. Proclamation honoring the life and efforts of Michael Sanchez for his leadership and contribution to Sawyer County. Whereas Michael Sanchez, a resident of the Winter community located in Sawyer County, Wisconsin, having lived in Sawyer County for the past 29 years after serving in the United States Navy, the National Guard, and the United States Naval Reserve, and whereas Mr. Sanchez served the Sawyer County community in various aspects as a law enforcement officer, a county deputy, and investigator, working with the Sawyer County Sheriff's Department and the Lecoutre Police Department, and whereas Mr. Sanchez developed the Sawyer County Search and Rescue Response Team with his wife, Patricia Sanchez, and whereas together Mr. and Mrs. Sanchez devoted countless volunteer time and effort training and developing an excellent search and rescue team that have saved lives and provided a safe and secure community. And whereas Mr. Sanchez retired from law enforcement functions after 17 years, but maintained his role as the Sawyer County Search and Rescue Coordinator. And whereas Michael Sanchez passed away on February 23rd, 2020, after a brief illness, he is survived by his wife and Sawyer County Search and Rescue partner Patricia, his daughter Marissa, son Michael, 4 grandchildren, Michaela, Devin, Ryder, and Skylar, and a great-granddaughter, Mariah. Now therefore it is proclaimed by the Sawyer County Board of Supervisors, Michael Sanchez's contributions to our communities, our country, and to our county is an example of inspirational leadership and a proud example of our law enforcement community. His contributions in developing our Sawyer County Search and Rescue Team will be our reminder of his love for his family and his community for the years to come. And be it further proclaimed, Michael Sanchez will always be a respected member of our community. The Sawyer County Supervisors, on behalf of the citizens of Sawyer County, want to acknowledge Michael Sanchez and his family for his dedication and service. This proclamation was discussed and recommended for adoption by the Sawyer County Board of Supervisors on its June 18th, 2020 meeting, as recommended by the Public Safety Committee on its meeting on June 4th, 2020. Mr. Chairman, we present this proclamation for consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Schlender. Mr. Helwig. Make a motion to approve the proclamation. Ms. Dennis?
I'll second it.
Okay. Got a motion by Mr. Helwig, seconded by Ms. Dennis, to approve Mr. Sanchez proclamation. Is there any further discussion? If none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. Thank you, Mr. Schlender. What an honor, Pat. and for you to be here. Okay. Moving on then to number 9, Public Safety Committee Chair Report. Mr. Schlender?
Mr. Chairman, we met on June 4th. Of the issues that were discussed, one of them has been school bus safety, and the Public Safety Committee, in its meeting at that time, voted to have a special session for public safety. That meeting will be held on Monday, June 29th, at the Lacouture Ojibwe College. It'll be held at 2 o'clock in the large auditorium. The major stakeholders have been invited. We're going to have a representative from the Hayward School District, the Lacouture School District, Winter, Bruce, Birchwood, the busing companies that work with the school districts, Hurricane Busing, Lacouture Busing, Indian Head.
Probably won't get anybody there from Indian Head, Mr. Chairman.
Oddly named on the reservation, but okay. We're also gonna have law enforcement, Sawyer County, City of Hayward, and the Lacouture Police Department. The agenda is going to discuss 3 major points. Public safety has met and had multiple hearings on this issue, and we're narrowing it down to 3 points of recommendation. One is identifying hotspots where there are high traffic, also in the location of where the children either get on or get off the bus, and then trying to coordinate with law enforcement to see if we can't increase presence. Second is the charging document under Wisconsin Statute 346. There's a specific criteria and time frame for when a citation can be lawfully issued against someone who violates or doesn't stop for a school bus. And that onerous time frame, it's very tight. It's like 24 hours and then 48 hours. And then there's a specific standard of information that needs to be produced. It's been a source of frustration for both law enforcement and for the busing companies. We're going to see if we can't develop a county ordinance to alleviate or to shift the burden of, or change the burden of proof for a charging document. And then the last one is a discussion with the busing companies and the school districts to see about if the school monitors can be included on all the buses. It's currently on the Head Start buses, and seeing if there's any remaining COVID money that's left that could assist school district in busing to allow for what would be a second set of eyes and another adult on these buses to work towards public, or for safety of the children. And so that meeting is going to be held Monday, June 29th at the LCO College at 2 o'clock. All COVID safety concerns will be in place, social distancing, masks, and whatnot. The other issue that was kind of raised is that as the sheriff alluded to, there's been a spike in the alcohol and drug consumption, charging, and documents. Our court system is still currently operating at very full capacity. The jail is at about 90% full capacity, with the same disparities in terms of what the population breakdown. So in the event, and I bring this up only to remind the county board members that we are still operating with a critical mass when it comes to our criminal justice system. And that concludes my report for public safety, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Schlender. We've got an action item up under B and C.
Oh, the CJC.
Yes, sir.
All right, so, second, criminal justice coordinating update. We met June 8th, and it was the first time that we had met in a while due to COVID and to quorum issues. We adopted formally a resolution to amend the bylaws. The bylaws has 3 significant changes. One is it recognizes the second Lacouture Tribal Governing Board appointee to sit as a voting member of the board. The second, it added 2 members of the public to serve on the CJCC, which is an advisory committee working to develop solutions to the criminal justice system and other recommendations, and also provide public feedback into the various aspects. And so there's the criminal justice system comprises law enforcement, court system, the DA's office, the public defender's office, probation and parole, and like outside agencies like like religious, educational, and other different aspects to help develop more efficient means of administering criminal justice. So we amended that so that the Lakudere Tribal Governing Board could have a second member. The previous permutation only allowed for one, and that was, the second seat was added because there's a memorandum of understanding between the county and the tribe, and the tribe contributes $25,000 on an annual basis to the CJCC budget. The county contributes, it's budgeted for $50,000. That's an issue that needs to be revisited later on, but that's not in front of us right now. And then the two members. And so there's a resolution that was adopted based on the actions that have been taken by the CJCC from the year 2019. And so, Mr. Chairman, I would ask that this body consider the resolution and adopt the bylaw changes for the CJCC.
So at this time, I'll entertain a motion then to approve the resolution and amend the bylaws of our Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee currently. Ms. Dennis?
Motion to approve?
Second. Okay, thank you. Got a motion by Ms. Dennis, second by Ms. Pettit, to approve the resolution to amend the Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee's Sawyer County bylaws. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Helwig?
I was just curious, am I actually on that committee?
You are.
You actually are.
Yep.
And I don't see, I don't know if I see the people on here and I need to sign the,
There's 2 Sawyer County supervisors and 2 Lakudere Tribal Governing Board members on that committee. Is there any further discussion?
I got no
If
discussion.
none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
I,
Opposed? Motion carries.
And that, Mr. Chairman, concludes both the CJCC and the Public Safety Report.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Okay, number 10, Public Works Committee Chair Report. Mr. Kinsley?
Public Works met on June 10th. The airport is looking at remodeling its terminal building, and that'd be totally their expense. They also have to redo the runway, and that's tentatively done in 2021. Highway Department has lost another worker this last week, and now we're down 2 from the spring, summer. So really, when it comes time to plow snow in the fall, winter, don't forget why it takes so long to get it done. Maintenance has done a wonderful job. You know, they have to do their daily work all the time, and we recognize the EMTs and the Sheriff's Department for doing an excellent job during COVID-19, which they do an excellent job. But let's not forget maintenance is out there cleaning the buildings to keep everybody from getting sick. And I think they do an excellent job with all their training and what they're getting done. That concludes my report. If anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kinsley.
Hearing none, we'll move on to California Avenue plat that we have. When we met on June 10th, we learned some new information that the city is looking at extending California Avenue, and if they were going to do that, we asked what the chances of us getting 5th Street closed so we could use it for us. And I understand that the city will be meeting the first week of July, so maybe we'll get an answer then, maybe we won't, but that's worth looking at.
Thank you, Mr. Kinsley. Mr. Hoff?
Yeah, Mr. Kinsley summarized quite nicely there. The discussions, preliminary discussions we had with the city of Hayward were as they built a new sewer line under the existing California Avenue, they had plans to extend that all the way to Nyman. And in order to do that, they would need to cross county land. Further discussion with the city came to light that maybe they would entertain the thought of closing 5th Street between the courthouse here and the jail, the 1 block area of 5th Street. It would be a land trade of those 2 swaps of property. The city has not contemplated that. They are meeting on July 13th with their Public Works Committee and City Council to discuss. So it's an opportunity that would allow the building of a courtroom that would have most of the advantages of that option 3 that we looked at across the street, whereas the prisoner transport could occur without crossing the street and be indoors. Lots of advantages that way at a much lower cost than that option 3 originally was. So Mr. Kane had further discussions with the sheriff as far as the layout of that, as well as Judge Yackel. I believe they had a discussion today as well. Just looking at that for viability, should it come to pass that Fifth Street becomes vacated and we could build between the buildings here. So we await the city's discussion on that item.
Okay, thank you, Tom. But Tom, you've been in touch with city officials and they sound favorable to this?
I have
proposal?
not personally, no. So it's preliminary until the city discusses it. They did allow us to discuss it. Somebody had to talk about it first. So John McHugh, the Public Works Director of the city, did say it was okay for us to entertain the idea and show support for it, if in fact you want to show support for it. So, then we'll await the city's discussion and action if there is any on that item.
Okay. That's for information only. Is there any other questions, concerns for Mr. Kinsley and the Public Works? None? Okay, thank you both. Moving on to number 11, second courtroom update, discussion and possible action. Mr. Hoff, if you want to start this for us, please.
Yeah, just a brief review again. Venture Architects did prepare a report for us last fall. We then reemployed them to look at some other options within the existing footprint of the county building. And they have finalized that report. And they have provided a constructability assessment as well in your packet. As we just talked about, since that time last month when we talked about it last, we did have the discussion with the city on California Avenue and started developing this option of building between the buildings, as I just said. So we've got a plan the start of a plan on what that looks like. We don't have it available tonight, nor do we have costs on that yet. But as I mentioned, that's being worked on in the possibility that that becomes available. We'll be ready to take a look at it. If Fifth Street does not become available, then what you're left with are the plans that were developed last fall and this spring, the 8 plans, whatever they were. And so those would be your options. And I think all of those, as we've talked, have some pluses, have some minuses. As we look at the Fifth Street option, I see a lot of good advantages there that take away some of the problems with the other options that we were looking at, such as cannibalizing our parking lot or decreasing the efficiency of the other departments within the building, having to move staff. Some of those things that happen in those other options are taken care of by that Fifth Street option if it becomes available. So it is an exciting opportunity for us if that goes through. So we look forward to hearing more about that. I believe Mr. Channing, the 10th District Administrator, is here, as well as Judge Yackel, if you had any other questions about the viability of any of those options that you're considering.
Yeah, and I talked to the sheriff. I would like to hear his opinion because I know he met with Mr. Kane regarding the Fifth Street option. So Doug, if you would let us know your thoughts on that, and then yours also, Judge Yackel, after him, please, because I know that you both met with Mr. Kane. And then I just want to say that prior to the Fifth Street option, Public Safety, Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee, and Public Works had all been in favor of Scheme 2, which is the building to the east. Oh, I'm sorry, Public Works, right, came with no recommendation. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Mrotek.
I think if we were able to move forward with the Fifth Street option, that would be a great advantage in many respects. I know, speaking on behalf of law enforcement, that would be a huge factor when it comes to the safety factors of escorting inmates and staff crossing as well, being able to connect there. We've been fortunate in the past. We haven't had any issues, but as we go into the future, as time goes on and we don't have that direct connect with facilities, I think the chance of something happening continues to increase. So I am very supportive of us being able to construct the second courtroom where Fifth Street is today and connect both buildings.
Thank you, Mr. Milter. Your Honor?
Thank you. Just to follow up with the sheriff, I'm in agreement with just about everything that he said. I think it's an opportunity that kind of came out of the blue and struck everybody just kind of wide-eyed, and that's clearly the best option if they can come in and it's in the same ballpark as the cost of those other options other than option 3. It gives us the advantage of option 3, like Tom said. And that is really my big concern, and in dealing with and working with the transport officers every day, and that's their safety and the safety of the people who are in custody. So I think it's a great option. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Channing, do you wish to say anything?
I just would say that the 10th district does concur with the Fifth Street option being the best potential available option, so.
Okay, and while you're there, is there any questions of Mr. Channing, as long as we have him front and center?
And if you would like also, I know that Chief Judge Boyle is on the Zoom meeting, so if there's anything that you want to ask her, we could have her raise her hand and you could let her in.
I want to say that we really appreciate this letter we got from you, which talks about the Second Circuit Court, the room, the judge, and the personnel we need to operate it. That was very helpful. Thank you.
I'm glad it,
Also, if we don't get a second judge, they aren't going to fund us with any more money to bring in any visiting judges.
well, it wouldn't be, that there wouldn't be funding. It's the fact that presently we know the situation you're in, but if you do not accept the second judgeship, you know, obviously there's a couple things in play. You need to build the courtroom, which is a massive undertaking. But if you do build a courtroom, and I believe some of the interpretation was that if you built the courtroom but not accept the second judgeship, you could potentially continue to use the resources that we're putting into Sawyer County. And I want to clarify that it's not a lack of funding, but it's a lack of availability for resources. So presently, we understand the situation that Sawyer County is presently in. We are taking resources from other parts of the 10th district and assisting you. Like I mentioned in the email or letter, that it is, you know, causing strain on those other parts of our district. So we do have presently the ability, and I realize it's a very big financial undertaking for the county to determine, for the supervisors to vote on, but you do have the opportunity to alleviate that pressure by accepting a second judge. So I don't know if that answers your
Yeah, that answers my question, but the facts are, it costs a lot of money to build that, and we're going to get money to do it and spend on operations also. But I know you can answer that.
I can't answer that, but I did try to hopefully alleviate some of the operation concerns, at least from staffing, to bring that to light. But there are still underlying operations funding that would need for that courtroom as you go forward.
Okay, Mr. Schlier.
Thank you. Probably 4 months ago, last time you were up here, I addressed you with some questions and concerns. And I asked you specifically, if we build the second courtroom, you will provide, the state will provide visiting judges. And you were pretty adamant about yes.
Yep.
That was a strong, positive answer on your part. I'm a little disappointed at this point in time that what changed? What happened? You mean the judges are all busy now? Or-
No,
I'm asking these questions respectfully.
Oh, no.
I don't want to sound.
You're not. No, you're not at all being disrespectful. And that is true. When I was here last time for the board and I did present, we were in a different situation. Since then, and I'm trying to remember if I put it in the email or I think I may have mentioned at one of the committee meetings. Since then, what has occurred is when I was first here, we did not know if the legislature was going to pass the judgeship bill. We didn't know if the governor was going to sign it. And we didn't know if the director was going to name Sawyer County as one of the counties. So with all of those caveats being in place, I did not want to hamper your decision in regards to building a second courtroom, because the concern at that point was, would we be awarded a second judge? So it was my understanding that the board at that time was concerned that if we build the second courtroom, we don't get awarded the second judge, would it be used? And so that's why I was very affirmative in regards to, yes, it would be used. Since the last time I was before all of you, the legislature has passed the bill, the governor has signed it, and the director has also named Sawyer County as the third tier of that group of counties that will be awarded a second judge. So with that being said, I just wanted to be clear with you that all of those things did change since I was last before you. So I was very affirmative in regards to, if you built a second courtroom and you did not get a second judge, we would still give you those resources. But the fact that you have been given the opportunity to evaluate the second courtroom, determine if you want to build it, and you also have been given the opportunity to get a second judge from the Director of State Courts. So that is what has changed since then.
Thank
We didn't, maybe we didn't, or maybe I didn't understand that if A, B, and C happened, which they did, that would change the whole tenor of the funding. I was not aware of that. Okay, thank you.
Well, 1 second, Troy. I do appreciate your sentence, though, that, Mr. Channing, that the second judge can be added without the need to add other staffing costs to the county.
And
It's
we've-
very optimistic and, so, Mr. Morgan.
That was my same question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay, Mr. Helwig.
You just said that, can you say again what you said about the district court saying that, will we authorize the judge or not? Or is that still in limbo till
Well, there are certain,
2023?
the director has named Sawyer County. There are still certain things that need to fall into place in order for you to be awarded a judgeship, which is obviously you need to have the facilities. And I believe we also need to continue to evaluate and put in place a drug court, which we are also working on as well. And those are the things that were in the bill in regards to making sure the facilities would be in place and then also the drug court. So depending on how you determine with the facilities, going forward with a second courtroom, that would impact, I think, whether you would get a second judge awarded to you. But I know the director has named you, and I'm glad that he went ahead and named all of those counties. It alleviates some of the guessing work, and it makes our conversation here today much straightforward and easier to have.
Mr. Morgan.
And the third requirement was to have passed a resolution, which we have done. That's in the bill, correct?
Correct. You did.
So the only thing left is to build the courthouse. And then, under our current situation, we would get that judge.
Yes.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Channing. Appreciate that. Okay, pleasure of the board. Mr. Helwig.
I have a question of you. That email, can we all get a copy of it? I don't believe we did.
You bet.
Could you forward that to us?
Yep, Tom, can we make sure everybody gets this?
All right, thank you very much.
Yep. Okay, so we got Mr. Schlender, I'm sorry.
So, at our last meeting, the chairman asked or charged 3 committees with reviewing the options that were developed by Mr., by, what is it,
Kane.
Venture
Kane.
Architect. Public safety met. We had a vigorous discussion about this, and the issue that came up from that discussion, which I think is not being, I don't know, not being presented or being vetted, was the issue of safety for the participants who would be going through the court, whether it's the alleged defendants or the jurors or the public itself. And one of the things that was raised was, or one of the points that was raised is that, well, we've never had any real issue about safety coming across the street from the courthouse. And the reason why that was raised is because we haven't had any, quote, high-profile trials. And I have to remind this board that we don't build on we don't make our decisions based on what happened in the past. We have to plan for the future. And there is a concern about the cost, but it's going to be one death. It's going to be one incident. It's going to be one shooting incident that's going to change this whole thing. I mean, we literally have protests across this country about the frustration that's come from the lack of the ability to participate in our criminal justice system. And so we want to make sure that we provide the safest environment. We did pass a resolution. The resolution says that we are in favor and we are going to take all the steps necessary to support a second judge. It's not going to be taking all the steps necessary to explore the idea of what our cost-cutting measures are, or what it is to bring in visiting judges. I mean, we should be able to handle our own business. Let's take care of our own business. Our property mill rate, we are the poorest county almost in the entire state. But if you were to go on the lakes and go out into the communities, you would see these $1 million houses and all of these other things where people come here to relax and enjoy and whatever, but we're not going to assure their safety. We're going to say that we're trying to cut $1 so that we could, not build a courthouse, but we'll bring in somebody else. We'll have someone travel from another part of the county. What if we have a safer at home, and is this judge going to come from somewhere else? And we're going to put him on a mask and put him on a ventilator or whatever it is that we're going to be doing? I think that we need to stay on track with what our responsibilities are as a county, respond to the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, and the Seventh Amendment of our Constitution, which provide for, a fair and adequate justice system for what they're being accused of. I will say at the CJCC, we had the same discussion again about the safety. And I will tell you that it was under great duress that we picked option 2 instead of option 3. Option 3 was the one that actually had probably the most consensus, but that comes in at a price tag at about $15 million. And so $15 million was a large pill to swallow. So what was the compromise was option 2, because that came in somewhere around, $3 or $4 million, and that was something that was a little bit more manageable. We end up losing parking space, which turned out to be a debatable issue. And then, of course, we get this, midnight option of what is it, 5th Street or whatever that street is between here and the courthouse. That option is something we need to explore. And whether that's at 3 million or at 10 million, that's something that we need to look at. And we need to start rationally discussing this, because I don't want to talk about defunding the police. I don't want to talk about, whatever else. We're talking about the responsibility that we have to provide for a safe, civil, respectful criminal justice system, and these are the steps necessary for that to happen.
Thank you, Mr. Slender. Mr. Olson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with Supervisor Slender wholeheartedly on most things. While I wish we could get a dispensation from the 10th District to use our small courtroom for a year, have that second judge here before we build something new, that would be great. I understand that that's probably pie in the sky thinking. Everything I'm hearing, I can't believe we haven't explored this 5th Street option before. We've talked about a tunnel under there for the last 10 years because of prisoner safety and jailer safety and everything else. I think we have to postpone until our next meeting. The other committees can take something up, and I'm sure our architect, Mr. Kane, will work on that fabulously. But I would have to make a motion to postpone.
I would entertain a motion.
And I would make that motion, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, I got a motion by Mr. Olson to postpone until our July meeting, when the committees can weigh in and we hear from the city council on our California Avenue and 5th Street vacation. Mr. Howie?
I would second that motion.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Howie. Motion by Mr. Olson, second by Mr. Helwig, to postpone this decision until our July meeting, when we can weigh in on the city council decision. Mr. Morgan?
Mr. Hopp, do we have enough residual from however much we've already funded our architects to have this available for us at the next meeting?
Mr. Hoff?
Mr. Kane is working on it, I know, because he has discussed that, and he has contacted Markin and Johnson to get pricing for that. I believe this is above and beyond what we had originally contracted him for, so I haven't had that discussion with Mr. Kane, but if there's a change order or something to that effect, we'll bring that back. But they have been very good to work with, and they've been to more meetings than they promised they would to start with, so they've done what they should do. Thank you.
Appreciate it. Is there any other discussion? Mr. Slender?
What exactly what action are we postponing? What were we going to do with this? update.
We are gonna, select an option that the county board is in agreement on, and then we will direct our finance committee to look into how we're gonna fund it. But we need to select an option. And I've got a motion now by Mr. Olson, second by Mr. Hellwig, to postpone until our July meeting when the city council can give us a decision. Is there any further discussion? Mr. Van Etten, do you want to weigh in here?
Well, the motion's on the table, but what I would like to say is I would like to move forward, whether we're going with a new option or number two, that we make a decision that, yes, we're going to do this. I get that we're going to postpone, but yes, either way, that we're going to build the courthouse.
Thank you. Okay, if there's no further discussion, all in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Opposed. Motion carries. Okay, moving on to number 12, Economic Development UW Extension Committee Chair Report.
Mr. Chairman, the Economic Development Committee met on June 8th. The main thing that we've been working on is basically having the various agencies that are reporting to that committee providing a training, because we have several new members on that committee. And as we get ready for our budget discussions, having those committee members versed with the obligations and responsibilities from those various reporting agencies is important. Second is on the agenda, we have essentially it's an odd action item, but we did have communication. Mr. Morgan reached out on behalf of the board, and it's had communication with the Wisconsin Economic Development Corporation regarding an endorsement from the county for various types of grants. I think they're grants. Correct. And so what we decided then was to have the county clerk serve as the point of contact. These grants they're popular, but they're very rare, and they usually require some kind of endorsement. And one of the endorsements can come from a county organization. And so we had decided then that Ms. Williamson would be in the best position to be able to respond. And so I believe we're asking for a formal endorsement of that. Do we need to do that? I mean, does that require a motion, Mr. Morgan?
Mr. Morgan.
I think it was just the action was actually to identify at the committee level. I don't believe, anyone can disagree, but it was just to identify a point person to actually write the letter of acknowledgement and endorsement. So I don't believe it does need a motion.
So, Mr. Chairman, if this board does feel that an action is needed, it would be a motion to recognize the county clerk as the point of contact for any WDC grant applications.
Perfect. Is that a motion, Mr. Schlender?
Only if it's needed.
I will allow it.
Would you like a motion?
Sure.
Well, I'll make that motion then to identify County Clerk Carol Williamson as point of contact for any WC following grant letters of acknowledgement.
Thank
I'll
you,
second
Ms.
that
Den-
motion.
Ms. Dennis?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Sorry, Jim. Okay, a motion by Mr. Morgan, second by Ms. Dennis, to name our county clerk as a reportee of any grant applications as worded by Mr. Morgan. Mr. Hellwig.
I just have a question before we get too far on. Like Mr. Van Etten had mentioned that, far as are we going to build the building, do we need?
You're off track here just a second, Mr. Hellwig. I'll let you speak in a second, okay? We got a motion on the floor regarding economic development. Is there any further discussion on the motion? Mr. Olson?
Just, I think, Mr. Chairman, that we should name the county clerk as opposed to Carol by name because of
Exactly.
I agree.
Okay,
events.
got the verbiage? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Morgan. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
And the last part is for the edification of the board. Our Surrey County LCO Economic Development Corporation has been very active during this pandemic, providing a lot of support for our local businesses, and attached under this report is a report of their activities during that time. That concludes the report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Slender. Okay, moving on then to number 13, Zoning Committee Chair Report. Mr. Buckholz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Not a whole lot to report. Still continuing to see a slight rise in the permit application based on the same time frames over the last few years. This is keeping the Zoning and Conservation Department extremely busy, even during this pandemic. And the Zoning Committee will hold its monthly public hearing meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30. That's it.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Buckholz, and we have a meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30, correct? Thank you. All right, moving on then to number 14, Land, Water, Forest Resource Committee Report. Mr. Paulson?
Okay, before we get to the two agenda items, the state law requires that the county every 15 years renew its, revise its forest management plan. And I think it's every 5 years we have to revise our outdoor recreation plan. So the committee is starting to look at drafts of these plans, and it'll be presented to the board sometime later, probably in the fall, November, December. And the second item is that year-to-date, we have collected $707,000 on stumpage, and if the weather cooperates, our county forester is cautiously optimistic that we'll make the budget of about $1.8 million. Then I'd like to move then to the two agenda items, unless there's any questions. If not, first one is the Windfall Cemetery resolution. This resolution has been approved by the town of Weirgor, and this is just the third extension of the cemetery. And I think by statute, we need to approve this as well.
I move we approve that. Mr. Duffy?
I move we approve that.
Okay, Mr. Buckholz?
I got one question. Bruce, we heard back from the town of Weirgor on that?
Got a motion on the floor.
I'll second it.
Okay,
Well, yeah, but I got to write to ask that, don't I?
You do. I got a motion from Mr. Duffy, second by Mr. Morgan to approve the resolution. Go ahead, Mr. Buckholz.
Well, I was going to second it, but
Okay.
never mind. Forget it.
No, the
No,
town of Weirgor did approve it.
Okay. Any further discussion on the motion? If not, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Okay,
And-
go ahead, Mr. Paulson.
Okay, the next item on our agenda is the waste storage ordinance, and I think I'll turn this over to the subject matter expert, Jay.
Jerry?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The waste storage ordinance, this is a proposed waste storage ordinance that's been 7 months in the making. It has gone through 3 public hearing processes, both combined at the Land, Water, Forest Resource Committee and the Zoning Committee level. At the public hearings, there were very little changes that were mentioned. One of the minor concerns that was brought up at that time was the aspects of the penalties and citations included in this ordinance. Currently, there is not reference in the proposed ordinance or in the current zoning citation ordinance that references any of these. It is my intent, though, to quickly work towards fully updating our citation ordinance as well, so there is actually meat then to this ordinance. To update a citation ordinance would also take several other months to get through the committee levels and then back to county board for approval. So you would be seeing that citation ordinance update as well. There were also several farmers that were in attendance at one of the public hearing levels. There were no issues that were brought up at that public hearing. The Land, Water, Forest Resource Committee farm rep at that time was also in support of the proposed ordinance. The proposed ordinance is actually to replace an existing ordinance that was adopted back in 1997. The 1997 version is very outdated, and we needed to replace it with the current NRCS technical standards and to bring up-to-date definitions and references. This is the third version of the proposed ordinance. It has been reviewed and approved by DADCAP, and also from the Sawyer County Legal Counsel has given its legal review on it as well. Because this ordinance technically is administered by the zoning department, it was reviewed and recommended for approval both at the Land, Water, Forest Resource Committee and the Zoning Committee levels. At that point, it was also sent out for town reviews. Out of the 15 towns that Sawyer County Zoning has authority in, 10 were in support, 4 were against, and 1 no reply. The ordinance in itself is to regulate the placement and construction of waste storage pits, also known as manure storage pits. This ordinance regulation would only be for those operations less than 1,000 animal units. Over 1,000 animal unit operation is regulated by DAGCAP. There's no specific requirements that make you have a manure storage pit. There's no threshold under that 1,000 animal unit that triggers you to have it. However, if you, the farmer, need one on the operation scale that you're running, then you would need to construct the pit and make it to the specific design requirements as specified in the ordinance. Otherwise, any daily land spreading or rotational grazing with no livestock barn structures that continue to be used, then you would not have to install one of these manure storage pits and meet the ordinance requirements. That's kind of my overview of the proposed ordinance you have in front of you. I would certainly help answer any questions you may have.
Why were was it 4 townships that voted against this?
Correct.
What was the major reason? Were they all, or was it similar reasons, or?
There were 3 against that had no comments. The only one that provided comments for not in support was this was already regulated by the DNR staff. That is true when it, again, is over 1,000 animal units. You are then considered a CAFO, a concentrated animal feeding operation. At that point, you need to meet the DAGCAP in correlation with the DNR technical standards. So they may have been a little misinformed as to where that regulatory boundary is.
Okay. Any other questions for Jay? If none, then I'll entertain a motion to approve. Ms. Dennis?
Motion to approve.
Motion by Ms. Dennis to approve resolution adopt Sawyer County's waste storage ordinance. Mr. Helwig?
Second.
Okay, second by Mr. Helwig. Is there any further discussion? If none, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed?
Good job, Jay.
Motion carries. Thank you, Jay. Okay, are you all set then, Mr. Paulson?
Yes,
Your report?
that's the end of my report.
Okay, moving on into number 15, Health and Human Services Board Report. Mr. Schleter.
Thank you. Health and Human Services Board met. We had some discussion about COVID-19. There wasn't a whole lot to report because of the Supreme Court's turning over most of the rules that they were working with. At that point in time on that evening, I believe it was still 9 people in the county that have been affected by COVID-19. Other than that, it's just, we're still holding in a good place. So the other thing that was discussed affects the budget. It's the cost of Sawyer County residents that we have to send to either Winnebago or Mendota mental health facilities. These are very, very expensive facilities, hundreds of dollars a day. Last year, we spent about $250,000 on these services. We're over that already this year considerably, and some estimates are we could reach $1.5 million. People, that's a budget buster. It depends upon the needs of the people that we're sending there, and these poor souls, they do not wish to be there. They're in a living nightmare, a living hell, if you will. Otherwise, they would surely be happier out living amongst all of us. So it's nothing we can blame or accuse. It's just something that we have to deal with. We also talked about potential avenues of how are we going to pay for this. The upshot of the discussion was we have spoken to our state legislators, both in the Assembly and the State Senate, We have approached the Wisconsin Counties Association, who did express interest, but apparently with everything else that is going on, it just hasn't been a real hot topic. I think we need to redouble our efforts with the Wisconsin Counties Association, because I think that's the only place we're going to get some relief. And that's pretty much the gist of the report.
Mr. Helwig.
Supervisor Schleter, have you guys looked into other options for the mental health? I'm sure you have, but what have
Yes.
you?
The problem is most of the facilities that we've used in the past have closed. It's a liability issue. It's Medicare payments not being enough to cover the costs. So, yeah.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Mr. Schleter. Any other questions for Mr. Schleter? Nope. Thank you, okay. All right, moving on to number 16, Finance Committee Chair Report. Mr. Paulson.
Thank you. The committee spent most of its time discussing how to close the budget gap. We talked about referendum, the pluses and minuses of a referendum, and then we talked about short-term borrowing to close the budget gap, and the committee is putting forward a resolution to use short-term borrowing to close the budget gap. I guess at this point I'll turn the floor over to Mr. Hoff and Mr. Keefe to lead us through the discussion on why this makes sense.
Thank you, Mr. Paulson. Mr. Hoff?
Thank you. Yeah, I put together just a short presentation that's going to be a review for some of you, but I think it hits on a lot of the important points as we kind of look forward to financing the next budget. What we're going to be talking about tonight is really a major shift in philosophy on how the county has produced a budget. And it's mainly due to the budget shortfalls that we see every year and the levy limits that have been in place for many years and the services that we need to provide that are mandated by the state for counties to provide to its citizens. So I just want to walk through some of the issues that bring us to where we are today. One being the levy limits. In Wisconsin State Statute, Chapter 66, which is just the municipal law statutes that all governments go by, a statute that says a county may not increase its levy in any year by a percentage that exceeds the county's valuation factor. What that means is we can only raise our levy, and the levy is the amount of taxes that we generate, property taxes, and we can only raise that amount that we raise by the amount of the net new construction in the county. There are a couple of exceptions. The county can utilize a statutory exception or conduct a referendum in which the voting body approves the increase. Those are the only exceptions to that levy limit rule. So the exceptions, what are the exceptions? The statutory exceptions that are allowed for you to go outside of the levy limits. One is debt service. Debt service is like a debt payment that a government makes against its debt. So the amount of a debt payment does not fall under those levy limits. So if we had additional debt for items, that is not included in the levy limit calculation. We do fund other things outside of the levy limits, those being the libraries, our EMS system, and some bridge and culvert construction fall outside of the levy limits. So that levy limit calculation kind of looks like this, and you see this slide each year as we present the budget and coming up with the levy limit. And so that number at the top is just the number from last year. And then the 73,000 amount, that's about what we get each year to increase that levy. So on about a $10 million budget, we are allowed by the state to spend an extra 73,000 thereabouts every year. That really is contributing to our budget issues because our costs go up obviously more than 73,000 a year. So every year we're creating efficiencies, we're eliminating things, we're trying to do things more creatively, and we're running out of those options as we go forward because it just perpetuates and builds on itself every single year. So therein lies the biggest problem. You'll notice then that the other special purpose levy, those things that fall outside the levy limits, as we just looked at, the library, the bridge and culvert aids, and the EMS costs all fall outside that levy limit. So we get a total levy of about almost $12 million because of those things that fall outside of the levy limit, including debt and those other items. Speaking of the EMS levy, that's one thing that this county has been really improving the past few years in the level of service that we are providing in the ambulance. This county took on the responsibility of providing ambulance service throughout the county, and it does cost us about $1.2 million to do that. How that relates to the taxes, that's another 34 cents per $1,000 of valuation, property valuation each year. So on a $100,000 house, you're paying about $34 towards EMS service. That's outside the levy limit, but that's a decision that the county has made, and you can obviously change that at any time, as well as any other service that you provide. But just trying to illustrate to you, the relationship between the services that we provide and the cost of those services and how they get paid for. Over time, our tax rate has changed. It's held relatively stable. Had some increases in prior years, and now it's been pretty stable, but that also is building some of the problem in that, our costs increase faster than our revenues can handle it. When we're talking about referendums and debt, we are talking about things that will increase people's taxes. And that's the options that we have. We're either going to significantly decrease services or significantly increase taxes to do the same thing that we're doing year after year. The other important thing to consider as we're talking about finances is fund balance. The county has adopted a fund balance policy, and there's different policies for different funds. Funds are just the different buckets that we use to account for the activity in the different functional areas. The biggest one being the general fund. So the general fund, as we recognize as Fund 100, that's where the so-called rainy day fund is. And the rainy day fund or fund balance is broken up into different things. Unassigned fund balance is the technical term that the accountants use to track the cash that we have on hand to handle emergency type things or cash flow items throughout the year. And so the policy that we have established is that we want that fund balance in a range of 20 to 33% of general fund expenditures. And that's a reasonable range. You don't want to go below 20% because then you might run into cash flow problems, especially as we experienced this year with the pandemic. We had unbudgeted costs that we suddenly had to pay for, and those get funded by using the cash that we have on hand, and then hopefully we get reimbursed for most, if not all of that, through some of the CARES Act or FEMA money that's coming back to us. But that's the reason that you need to have a fund balance, is because these things do crop up, and you need a way to fund them as they do, and even just the annual cash flow needs. Since we get taxes, twice a year, but we've got expenses all year, so we've got up and downs in our cash balances as well. You also don't want to get too high because then you're taxing people and not using the money that you taxed them for. So, that range is a nice balance of not too low, not too high. Unfortunately, we are at the lower end of that range currently. I believe at the end of 2019, we're virtually down to that 20%, and so we don't have any room to go any lower. How does fund balance get accumulated? Well, as you budget each year and you beat the budget, because you always try and stay under budget, obviously, and if you do, you create a little bit extra that then falls into that fund balance category. And when you go over budget because you incurred expenses that you had not anticipated or other things like that, then that reduces your fund balance. And so our fund balance has been slowly depleting to the point where we really can't afford to deplete it any further. Just generally then, looking at the sources of revenue that the county has available to it. So these are categories of revenues that we have, and these are from 2018. And the reason I use 2018 is because I pulled these off of the Department of Revenue information. And so all of the counties haven't submitted their 2019 information, and it hasn't been compiled by the DOR. So 2018 is the latest numbers that they have available. And the reason I did that again is we're going to have some comparables with other counties, and I just wanted to use this data because we have data from other counties. We've got our own data, of course, for 2019, but not the other counties. But just taking a look at this generally, you can see that, you know, the brown circle, portion of the circle graph there shows that over 50% of our revenue comes from taxes, and those being property taxes, sales taxes, and maybe a couple other minor taxes. But the majority of our revenue does come from the property tax base. There are some other sources we get. The intergovernmental revenues are things like the state and federal aid that come through. And charges for public services are things that we charge ourselves for the services that we provide. So those are the basic categories that we're looking at. And so the majority, again, is from those taxes. On the expenditure side, this kind of gives a breakdown by department or major funding areas. Health and Human Services obviously is a big one. General government, those are all the things that administrative type staff does. Law enforcement and other public safety, you know, those combined are another big ticket item for us, as well as ambulance and highway. So those are basically the big money departments. And so when we're talking about cutting services to the extent that we would need to do to balance the budget, those are, you know, kind of the departments that would have the most detriment to their budgets, because we would not be able to get to the point we need to with the smaller departments, obviously. So as you think about our options, you know, you have to think about what services we're providing, how much do they cost, and are there any that you don't want to fund anymore? Excuse me. These are just some graphs and some comparables with other counties, and we just picked some of our neighbors here that we deal with a lot, and counties that are rural and about the same size as us. So Ashland is pink, Bayfield is gray, Burnett County is kind of a purple, Price is blue, Rusk is green, Sawyer is that gold kind of color, and Washburn is another shade of pink, apparently. But if you look at the general government per capita, and that's the way that the DOR has kind of laid out this data. And if you go to the DOR website, you can look these up yourself and look at other items as well. But what I wanted to show you was just the general government per capita. That is, per person, how much does it cost to provide general government services? And you can see we're kind of in the middle of the road and have been as far as expenses for general government. What I was looking for is just like, you know, what can we cut? Are we spending more money in areas that we shouldn't be, and compared to others? You know, is there, or are we you know, providing about the same level of service as our neighbors and that sort of thing? So Health and Human Services as well, kind of middle of the road. Looks like we got a little excited there in 2010 through 12, but basically, you know, right in there with our other counties as far as spending on human services. Human service. Law enforcement, again, middle of the road for the most part. Highway maintenance, this is just the maintenance side, not the capital side. There was a couple of years there, 15 and 17, that they didn't have the data for. But again, you know, kind of on the lower end of spending for highway maintenance items across the other counties that we deal with again. Another interesting one is total debt service per capita. Again, debt service are those debt payments that are made on debt. This looks a little bit wonky if you know, look at it to begin with, but if you look at our line, you know, the gold line, we had that spike in 2012. Those spikes really represent like a refunding of debt. Like if you can get a lower interest rate or whatever, if you've got $2 million worth of debt out there, you can refund it with lower interest. So when you do that, you're making a huge payment. So that's what those blips are. It's not that they're adding that much debt and it goes away. It's just that 1 year that they had a refunding. But just overall, if you take out the blips, you can see that Sawyer County is at the lower end of debt service. And that's because we've used debt very judiciously here in the county in the past. We only have one debt issue outstanding currently, and that's for the jail enhancement that was done several years ago, and I believe that debt runs until 2024. But that's the only debt that we have out here. We have not issued debt historically, at least to my knowledge, for other capital items. And those capital items are being funded currently within the operating levy. So we've got capital items that could be funded by debt, and by funding them by debt, they do fall outside the levy limit. And so it's an effective way, and a legal way, and a rational way to fund those items through the issuance of debt. What we were talking about is short-term debt, where you could issue that debt and pay it off in the next year. So what you would do is, if you issued debt, set up an amortization schedule, which would be paid off like in 2 months in the following year, some sort of scenario like that, so that it is true general obligation debt, considered debt by the Department of Revenue. We did have a discussion with the Department of Revenue about this plan and the requirements and things that they're looking for as well. So this is something that other governments do. It's perfectly legitimate within the statutes. But it is a way of funding those capital items through debt outside of the levy limit. What does that do for us? Well, it frees up operational costs then for the things that we are currently doing. Each year we have a funding issue of about $900,000 to $1 million of things that we could be doing, should be doing, but can't afford to do. And that happens every year, and has happened every year, and will continue to happen every year, in the sense that, you know, we try and balance the budget by being more efficient, cutting some things, rearranging some things, and, you know, those things have been done. And so now we're at the kind of the end of the road, and what are we going to do next? That's what generated the discussion on referendums to begin with. That is an option, of course, available to us as well. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through this. So the options to address these increasing costs, you know, what can we do? We talked about one of your options is reducing services, and it would take, you know, a significant reduction in some of those bigger departments. And if we did that this year, that's great. It could balance a budget. And then next year we have to do it all over again. And the next year we do it all over again, because those costs would rise higher than the $70,000 that we get in net new construction. Another option is, you know, depleting the reserve accounts. Well, we've kind of run through that as well. We are down to the 20% in our reserve accounts. And so that really isn't an option to address increasing costs any longer. There are fees and other sources of funding that could be increased. There's also other funding mechanisms allowed under the statutes. There's been discussions over the last couple of years about the vehicle registration fee, or wheel tax. You know, that's an option to you. And that's something that the county can enact statutorily, is allowed. That generates money for transportation type costs. So if you enacted a $10 wheel tax, that'd be $160,000 a year. There's about 16,000 vehicles subject to that vehicle registration fee. That's something that the board has not opted to do at this point, and that's fine. But that's one of the tools in the shed. We've had a lot of discussion about room tax. Room tax is not an option that the county can enact, but it does help us in the sense that we do fund the Visitors Bureau. And the Visitors Bureau obviously generates economic activity within the county, so it's a good thing to have happen. And we've encouraged towns to enact room taxes. Some have, some haven't, and that's fine as well. But it's an option that helps the county in our funding of the Visitors Bureau, which is also within the levy limits. Premier resort tax is not something that the county qualifies for. It is a statutory thing that counties or municipalities more generally can do, but it requires the entity to have a certain amount of commercial valuation in relation to the whole valuation, so we don't qualify because we don't meet that threshold. Unfortunately, so like the Wisconsin Dells and Door County, I believe, are premier resort areas that can charge an additional tax. And going through the other options, securing additional grants and other sources of funding, those are things that we obviously do as well. And as I was writing this slide, I had just received an email on, looking at a grant out of the Health and Human Services Department. I got an email that some other counties had received this grant, and I inquired, did we look at that? And I got a very good response back on how thorough they are in looking and seeing if we qualify and if they do any good to the county on these grant opportunities. There's obviously other grants, that we could pursue and look at. So that's a funding source for us as well. Option number 5, increase borrowing for capital assets. That's kind of what we were talking about then, is and something that the county has not done, is borrow for capital assets. What is a capital asset? That's something that's got a longer life than 1 year. So it's not operations, it's not payroll, it's not the light bill, it's not the water bill, it's the squad cars, it's the equipment, it's buildings, it's those capital items are considered capital in the accounting sense, that is an asset that lasts for longer than a year. And it is legitimate to borrow for those and pay for them through debt. The last one is the referendum to increase the levy limit, and that is something that Finance Committee has seriously considered, and considered it as a last resort. It is a last resort. It's very difficult to pass a referendum. It's risky as far as planning purposes. It also goes away. To do a referendum, you can do it into infinity or a certain number of years. If you did it for 5 years, that's great. You might be able to get by for 5 years, but then you either have to do a referendum again, or you have to decrease your services through the loss of funding when the referendum period ends. So there's some pluses and minuses to that. And the committee wanted us to seriously consider all of our other options before going to a referendum. We actually did have a resolution prepared on what a resolution to do a referendum looked like. And that was, I believe, last month at the Finance Committee. But in those discussions, again, it was how can we exhaust all of our other tools in the shed, all of our other options before we get to that last item. So the borrowing is an item that we had serious discussion on, healthy discussion in the Finance Committee last month. And we've done some projections. Finance Committee wanted us to do some budget projections, which we have done, and included this borrowing idea. So I'll have Mike Keefe, our financial guru, come up and kind of go through just some of the details. But if you've got any questions on some of the things that I've covered now, you can ask that at this time, or we can ask at any time after Mike gets through some of the details as well. It is a new concept for us. It's not a new concept for governments. But if you've got questions, we'll certainly entertain those as well. Mike?
Okay, thank you, Tom.
Mike, how long is your presentation, did you say? We were just wondering about a quick 5-minute break.
We can do that. No,
Do
it'd be
that?
best.
Everybody okay with that?
Yeah.
I'm gonna recess for 5 minutes.
5 minutes consecutive?
Alex, can you reshare then? Are you doing it? I stopped sharing, so does that automatically go back to?
Yeah, it goes back to just showing video.
Okay.
Go? All right.
Yep.
All right, so as Tom said, the focus of the discussion to follow now is going to be on borrowing for capital assets and how that may impact our budget as we go forward. Carol, do you have this stuff you can put on screen? I wanted to start with the resolution, maybe.
Hang on.
There you go.
Mr. Schleier, hang on. You handed out those, right, though, Mike? Or not that?
Not the resolution, I don't. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Keefe.
All right, so I just want to, this resolution in your packet is not authorizing, even though it says to authorize the issuance of debt, that's not what this is doing at this point. If you go to the second page, Carol, under now therefore be it resolved, line 45, the county board determines that it is necessary to plan for issuance of debt. So that's really the purpose of this resolution at this time. It's not, you're not authorizing debt right now. It's just planning for it in the 21 budget. And then if you go back to the first page of the resolution, there's two parts of this resolution that I kind of want to address. The first part is line 23, where it's talking about an estimated shortfall in the amount of approximately $1.5 million. I want to kind of discuss how or where we're coming up with that number. That's kind of part one of the discussion. And then down on line 32 of the resolution, where it says, whereas on June 11th, the County Finance Committee discussed the options to address the budget shortfall and determined that it is the best option to create additional operating levy by funding certain capital projects currently in the operating budget by issuing debt when planning for the 2021 budget. That's kind of part two of what we're going to talk about. Then my handout, I'm going to flip to page 3. The first 2 pages are just county demographics that we'll come back to those. But first I want to flip over to page 3. So when Tom was going through his budget presentation, he mentioned how every year we go through the budget process, departments turn in their requested budget, and we're always $900,000 to $1 million over what levy limits allow us to be at. So we always got to cut that amount of levy, right? Well, of the $1.5 million we're talking about in the resolution, we're just estimating at this point, $1 million is to cover that cost. So it's covering $1 million worth of operational costs that we're always over every year, year after year after year. We've been under levy limits for so long now that it's getting really difficult to find ways to cut that $1 million every year. It's just hard. I mean, it's 2010, I think, is when the current levy limits went into existence, and that's, net new construction. For Sawyer County, that's been 0.5% to 0.75% a year, $73,000, I think Tom's number figured, and we're $1 million over. And then before that, there were levy limits. They weren't quite as restrictive as what they currently are, but there were levy limits going back, I don't know, Dale, do you remember? 2004, 2005 levy limits came into, and some counties were even imposing their own. Yeah. So anyway, we've been under levy limits a long time. It's getting difficult. So page 3 just kind of puts in numbers in front of you how we're kind of arriving at it. So the 2020 column is the existing budget that we're under right now. So total expenditures are about $28.5 million. We have revenues excluding levy of close to $19 million. So our allowed levy for 2020 is $9,815,000. So now in 2021, I've come and put together a projection, and it's just a projection. We'll know what the real numbers are early in August. Departments will go through the budget process. They're supposed to turn them in by the end of July. We'll compile them, and within a week or two, we'll know what the true levy need is at that time. But anyway, based on this projection, expenditures, $29,650,000. Levy revenue, close to $19 million. So the levy we would be requesting based on the projection would be about $10,789,000. Well, that's $973,000 more than what was allowed in 2020. So our costs, what we're anticipating being budgeted by departments, is going to be $973,000 over 2020, but net new construction is only going to allow us to be about 70,000 over. So take the budgeting overage of 973,000 less the approximately 70,000, we're looking at somewhere around a $900,000 operational shortfall, if you will, an amount we're going to have to cut. So that's, again, that's of the 1.5 million, we're saying $1 million, approximately $1 million, is because of this operational shortfall. That's kind of part one. Questions? No? Okay. Yep.
For emphasis, the 973,000 is operating shortfall, not a capital shortfall. It's just from salary increases, health insurance increases, things like that.
It can include capital because to this point, we've paid for capital with funds on hand or some levy money. But going forward, and we're going to point that out in a second, we're switching. All right, so page 4 is a 5-year projection on capital. I'm really only going to focus on 2021, but we're showing 5 years because, you know, we're talking about a courtroom, so I built that into these projections. And all right, so in capital for 2020, capital expenditures budgeted about 500,000. We have some small revenues. We're selling some vehicles. And then we're transferring about 230,000 from the general fund to capital to cover the 500,000. And we've got about $224,000 of levy in capital to cover capital. Well, as Tom alluded, our fund balance, we're at our lower limit of where we want to be. So we're not recommending any more transfers from the general fund to capital to cover capital. And the levy that's in capital, we need just to cover operational. So we're backing that out of capital. So if you look at 2021, the projection at this time is $565,000 in expenditures, minus a few expenses or revenues of about $74,000. There's still about $491,000 that we haven't covered yet. Except to say, if you look over to the left, it says proceeds from debt issuance. We're now recommending going forward, 2021 and forward, that we start covering that difference, that balance with debt. So again, the $1.5 million, $1 million of it from operational shortfall. Now we're shifting about $500,000 of capital to debt. So that makes up the $1.5 million. Everybody kind of follow that? Bruce, is that? Yeah. Okay, so that's the $1.5 million. That's how we're arriving at the $1.5 million. Now, part 2 of the equation is borrowing for capital based on, we know we need $1.5 million. How are we going to accomplish that? So if you look at page 5, page 5 is a summary of the debt service fund. Slight correction, sorry, Tom. There's actually 2 items of debt we have right now. We have the jail expansion, which ends in 2024, like Tom said. We also have the Ojibwa ambulance building, which we took that debt out late in 2019. Our first payment, that's spread over 10 years, but our first payment will start in 2020 this year, and within a month, we'll make our payment. So anyway, on that list, going down the rows, the first two items, we currently have that debt, the jail and the Ojibwa ambulance. And for 2020, that's all we have. But if you look at 2021, okay, we still have the jail, we still have the Ojibwa ambulance, but now we're adding the capital improvement projects, the 490,000. So I'm kind of reallocating it out of operating, pushing it over to capital, using proceeds, debt proceeds to pay for it. We're also, I'm calling it highway capital, and I'll explain why in a minute, but it's really that 904,000 operational deficit that we talked about. That'll be borrowed. And then there's also a one-time project in 2021. One of our dams, I think it's the Brunette Dam, is scheduled for 2021, and the county share of that project is about $278,000. There might be a little bit of money in the resource development that we could use for some of that, but as we get into the budget process, we'll kind of nail that number down. But for now, planning, we need to borrow all of that. So with interest, we're looking at total debt service in 2021 of $1,958,000. About $1 million, the 1.5 is the increase. That is going to be an increase to the taxes. So simple example, highway has, round numbers, highway purchases $500,000 of equipment every year. Currently, we're paying for it with levy. If we borrow the money, if we borrow the 500,000, take the proceeds, put it in the highway budget, now we can pull out $500,000 worth of levy in their budget and kind of transfer it over to the operational side to cover the operational shortfall that we have. Does that kind of make sense what we're looking at doing?
Yeah.
I mean, in its simplest form, that's what we're looking to do. So we're identifying operationally how much we need, but we're using it, we're identifying capital and using capital to stay within statutory guidelines for the borrowing. Like Tom said, if we go with this, we would look to borrow the money early in the year and within 2 or 3 months, pay it off. You know, $4,000 or $5,000 worth of interest cost to do this. As he mentioned, there are other counties doing this. I know at one time Washburn was doing it. I don't know if they still are, but I think Ashland is doing it. I'm sure there's others doing it. It's kind of the workaround for counties that are struggling to meet the operational budget. It's just kind of the next step and tool in the,
Tool in the shed.
Yep.
So what is, 1.5 million, what does that equate to as a percentage increase in the levy limit? Do you have a ballpark? I mean, what would that raise?
Well,
Yeah, per 100,000 assessed value.
well, all right, so then let's go to page 6. Page 6 is a summary of, it breaks out the 3 levies: operating levy, debt levy, special purpose levy, total levy. So you see 2020. Then I put in what we're projecting for 2021 in each of those categories. So right now, the increase is about $1,750,000. I know that's not what the resolution is showing, but for now, that's what it's showing. So the tax rate on that is 0.473. So that equates to, for a $100,000 house, that would be $47.34 additional tax, property tax. Now, on $1.5 million, if the $1.5 million is the number we go with, it'll be a little lower than this 0.473, but.
question, Mr. Howard?
Yeah, you know, when we borrow that, how do we pay that back in such a short period of time? You're saying like 2 months?
Yep, so, we levy, so we're actually increasing the levy by $1.5 million. And we would borrow the money and then pay it off with that levy in the existing year. This proposal is a tax increase.
For 1 year.
Well,
For this
we
one.
would, for this year, I mean,
Yeah.
it's, we would look to do a similar thing each year. The amount might not be the same. Right now, my projection would be the following year would be a little less, just because we're not doing the dam project the following year. And my projections right now are showing that following year to be a little bit less.
Oh, Mr. Olson.
I'm just trying to wrap my head, I trust Mr. Keefe implicitly when it comes to this stuff, and I'm certainly not one that knows much about it, but I'm trying to decipher how I talk to my constituents when I go to the Coudray Town Board, the Meteor Town Board, the Edgewater Town Board, and say, no, see, it's okay, because we're gonna borrow the money and increase the taxes, but then we'll pay it back in the year, and they're gonna say, it sounds like you're gaming the system. And I have to come up with a way, I can say, oh, it's better than a wheel tax, because I can guarantee they will not burn me in effigy, they'll burn me for real.
Right.
But at the same time, please, we have to have a way to present this in a like fashion.
Right. So currently, we've been able to maintain kind of a pay-as-you-go system for capital. And, we're at the point where we can't do that anymore. We have to start borrowing for capital needs, and we're trying to pull in some operational into the borrowing. If you go back to pages 1 and 2 of the handout, we pulled some information. Again, the source of this is the Wisconsin Department of Revenue website. And we only have data through 2018 at this point. But I highlighted or pulled out a bunch of different demographics for the counties Tom mentioned, kind of our surrounding counties that we use for comparables. And we can kind of compare where do we stand with each of these counties. Now, the first item on the handout I gave you is general property tax. And you notice I added net there in parentheses. I just want to point out that Sawyer County has levy for EMS or ambulance services. But to my knowledge, none of these other counties do. So kind of to be apples to apples, on Sawyer counties, I backed out the share levy that's attributable to EMS levy. So that's why I say net. You see the same thing down under local tax rate. I reduced the local tax rate to the equivalent of that EMS levy. So you can see general property tax, how do we compare? General obligation debt outstanding, how do we compare? Debt service, annual debt service, these are your principal and interest payments. You can see how we compare. Again, I'll just caution under the debt service category, when you see spikes, like under 2018, Price County, you see a big spike, that's because of a refunding in that particular year. You can kind of see the average, but you kind of got to ignore the spikes. The local tax rate, if you look at that, Sawyer County is the lowest of this category, in some cases by far. You can see population of the different counties. Yep.
Oh, yep.
What do we mean by local tax rate?
Yep, I'm
What does that mean?
gonna come back to that in a second. Population of our comparables, we're on the high end there, but pretty close with everybody. The second page back is equalized valuation. We're pretty significantly higher than everybody in our comparable list. That's the value of real estate that's taxed for property tax purposes. And then you can also see I gave you land area, the number of square miles by the different counties. And Sawyer County, with the exception of Price, is, well, and Bayfield, I guess, you know, our land area is pretty large compared to our comparables. Okay, so this, how do I define local tax rate? And it kind of goes to Dale's question too. So local tax rate is really, you take your property tax, divide it by your equalized value, multiply it by 1,000, and you get a tax rate. That tax rate is what is used to calculate the property taxes that go on your property tax statement. So in Sawyer County, look at 2018, $2.39, 2.939 is the tax rate. Versus Ashland, which is over a tax rate of over 6. So they're paying almost 2 times more tax on valuation of home than what Sawyer County is. Their tax rate is double what ours is. I don't know where Sawyer stands anymore. Bruce might know. At one time, I think Sawyer had one of the lowest tax rates in the state. I don't know if that's like.
You had your light on too earlier, Mr. Paulson. You want to comment, please?
Yeah, I mean, we do have one of the lowest tax rates, but we have, we're 4 counties have the highest assessed value. Sawyer County, Vilas County, Door County. So the reason our tax rate is so low is because of the high assessed value for the $1 million homes and things like that.
Yeah, so for the same value of home in Sawyer, you're paying less than you would in another county.
Mr. Schlender.
So explain this to me then. Why are we collecting less if the property is worth more? I mean, if Mr. Olson has to go back and explain that we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, to pay for the services that we're offering, but we're also not taking enough money from Paul in the first place to fund the services that everybody expects us to have, but yet we still have these large houses. I mean, isn't half our tax base owned by someone that lives somewhere else? So
right.
I'm missing, there's a major disconnect. If we're the lowest and our operating cost, we're borrowing from ourselves in order to pay for the services for everyone else, why are we doing that?
Good question.
I can't hear you. We haven't raised the tax at all, apparently. I mean.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, you got to be a little bit careful when you talk about raising taxes, because we have raised taxes like the EMS. We have raised that in the last 2 or 3 years, but that's outside the levy limit. Within the operating limit, we're limited to that net new construction amount, which is, you know, somewhere around $65,000 to $70,000 a year. That's all we can raise our levy limit, our taxes by. I'm a little cautious when you say rob Peter to pay Paul. It sounds like you're kind of skirting around something deviously. That's not what we're doing. I mean, this is approved. It's allowed to do. It's just each year it gets harder and harder and harder, and you kind of got to go to the next step that you can do that's maybe not always beneficial or what you would maybe want to do in a normal situation, but we're not in a normal situation anymore.
So let me just, Rob Peter, isn't that a biblical reference to something about borrowing something from within yourself? So just because it's legal doesn't make it correct, right? But the fact that we have these obligations and responsibilities that we have as a county, then it doesn't come for free. And so we're asking for the operating funds to provide the services that everyone expects. So if they call 911, they expect the ambulance to come. Now, if they're paying $150,000 in property tax, or if they're renting for $50 a month, that ambulance is going to be there at the same amount of time regardless. So we still have to figure out how to raise this money, because everybody has an equal opportunity to doing this. And this is precisely why we have those protests going on all over the country.
Thank you, Ms. Schlunder. Yep. Okay, are you about wrapped up the mic, or do you have one?
Yeah, I just,
And I gotta go back to Bruce.
Just one more point. I mean, if you look at land area, square miles, you know, Sawyer County has a lot of area. You know, that in and of itself can explain why maybe your budget is different or higher than somebody else. You have more area, you need more highway people, or probably more law enforcement, probably, because you got a lot larger area that you're, so I mean, you can look at things like that to help explain why, well, you know, there are reasons.
Okay. Mr. Paulson? Thank you, Mike.
Maybe I can take a shot at answering Mr. Olson's question, and I think Mr. Schlender's touched on it, is that if we don't find another source of revenue, either a referendum or short-term borrowing, we're going to have to cut services. We're going to have to cut $1 million worth of services. So it's really up, when you go to talk to your people, okay, you don't want to pay the taxes, then do you want to wait and plow snow when it's 5 inches rather than 3? Do you want 2 less sheriff's deputies? Those are the issues that we're dealing with. So, I mean, we have one choice: find another source of revenue or reduce services. I mean, it's as simple as that. You can do it by referendum, or you can do it by short-term borrowing. Short-term borrowing has a little interest cost attached to it. I figured out it's about 10 cents per $100,000 of valuation. So the interest cost is negligible. So, and if you go for the referendum and the referendum fails, then what do? You got to cut costs.
Right.
You know, so this is a planning tool, and most other counties surrounding us do it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying it's right because it complies with this law. So I guess that's about it, I guess.
Okay, so Mr. Paulson, I was sitting at the Finance Committee meeting, and the Finance Committee then approved this resolution to come to the full county board for approval? Yes. Okay, Mr. Schluter, then I'll go to you, Mr. Elwood.
If we go for a referendum, and I was speaking with Mr. Hoff about this during the break, and it fails, why can't we go ahead and borrow at that point in time?
I think you can, but in the interim, you've got all of our employees, you know, on pins and needles because they don't know who's going to be cut or what services are going to be cut. I mean, and that's one of the primary issues, is that we need to.
But if we're going to borrow $1.5 million, and we decide to do $1.5 million referendum, if we get the referendum, our budget is covered. If we don't, we borrow, and our budget is still covered. Nobody has to sit on pins and needles. Well, what am I thinking wrong about this?
You're right.
Yeah, what, maybe the timing of the referendum.
It's a planning issue.
Yeah.
Mr. Hoff has got.
Mr. Hoff, sorry.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just a couple of things. You know, I think going back to the beginning, you know, if you look at history in Sawyer County, and some of the people who've been on the board a while can probably attest better than I can about how we got to this point, but this board of Sawyer County has historically been very prudent and conservative in their budgeting. And The budgets have historically been low and the tax rates have historically been low, and that's a good thing. But then when levy limits went into place, we were locked in at those lower taxing levels. And so then we were forbidden from increasing the levy to the point where we could provide services to the same level that we're providing now. You know, this $1.5 million debt that we're talking about, it's not robbing Peter to pay Paul. It's taking out debt to pay for capital items. It's like what you do when you buy a house or buy a car. It's a way of financing. What we're suggesting is, instead of paying it off over 5 years or 20 years and incurring extra interest costs related to that, and especially if this occurs every year, that you pay it off in the following year, so your debt payments remain constant. Your tax rate then becomes stable, although at a new level. But it does allow us to sustain the services that we're providing now. Another point is that this is not a way to increase services and to fix all of the other problems we have in the budget. Mr. Schlueter mentioned the Winnebago costs that are sometimes way over what we have budgeted for them. You know, this is a new phenomenon with the mental health issues going on now. But, you know, we could exceed the budget in the mental health area by $1 million. And this doesn't fix that. This just gets us to where we are now. And if you don't do this, that's fine, that's a choice. But then we are cutting $1 million or more of services, and that's fine too. But that's your choice. And so that's what we're trying to do is allow us to plan one way or the other on what we're going to do. And we can cut services, and we can identify what those are, or we can maintain the services that we're providing now and pay for them in this fashion. And it's a financing tool.
Can I go to Mr. Howley, Mike?
Would this be something that, you know, the loan or the debt that we'd be possibly looking at annually to keep up with our situation?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Pettit?
We also have to realize, like we're saying, is that we want to maintain the services we have that are not even, we're not fully staffed. We have people that people have left. Our employees then pick up their work. They're doing 1.5 of a job, just like the judge is we're looking to fund for a courtroom because of 1.5. The level of services we're providing now is not enough. So we have to figure out what we need to do. We're so short-handed. We have people that, we're lucky that we are even retaining the employees we have. We don't have a psychiatrist on staff anymore for the mental health. Then it plays into, we don't have the money for other programs that we need to put in place if we're going to vote to bring for the courtroom and to bring a second judge in. We have to have the funding. We have to go above and beyond because we have to have funding for programs, because we can't just do the circuit court and not do health and human services. You have to do both. We owe it to our constituents. That's our job. We just can't say, well, the services are that and that's it, and cut them. We have to borrow. It's the only solution.
Thank you, Ms. Pettit. Mr. Paulson?
A broader answer to Mr. Schlueter's question. If the referendum is November 2nd, we have to, I think, certify the budget, let me say November 10th. So how are we going to determine what services, you know, how are we going to do the process?
Okay. Oh, Mr. Morgan?
And one of the other things that we did discuss in the Finance Committee, we're not saying, we never said that we never want a referendum. It's just this specific year and this specific timing, it's going to be really, really difficult. There's nothing to say with the new changes in Wisconsin statutes that we couldn't look at a referendum perhaps at a different time that'll allow us to plan for that year going forward rather than have to scramble around in 7 days.
Mr. Olson?
I just want to reiterate, I'm not saying good, bad, or otherwise. I have to be defensible to the people who elected me, and so does everybody in here. And with that, you know, I'm sorry, but saying, when are we gonna plow the roads and do you want a cop to be on duty? I mean, that's almost, you know, that, law enforcement is number 3 and highway is number 7 on our list of our heavy hitters for expenditures. You know, they're not even the top 2. But we have to be able to have some kind of scheme, system, defensible position to say, this is why we have to do this is what we're doing. And, you know, we haven't even looked at cutting any expenses yet. But if that's what we have to do, and I agree with Ms. Pettit, I think that's probably our only viable option. Let's at least have something put together on paper to take to the people that are gonna wanna know.
Agree, Mr. Olson, thank you. Mr. Schlender?
So, following with Mr. Olson's discussion point, I think we're dealing with two things here. One is, we're dealing with a revenue base that's been locked in since, what, 2005, with 2020 cost levels. I mean, we want to make sure that salaries stay competitive. We took a major hit with the insurance premiums from last year to this year, which was something like a $300,000 increase, I think, over the budgeted amount. And so what we're trying to do, and this is not it's an unfortunate practice, because we have these expectations of this economy. I mean, when the economy got negatively impacted by the pandemic, everybody had to borrow money to cover their expenses. And so we have the cash store for individual incomes, and what we're essentially trying to do is do the same thing with what our budget is by borrowing against what we have now, transferring it so that we can get some money later on in the year to pay that off, making sure that we stay afloat, because we don't want to raise taxes on the property, but we still have the expenses of everybody else. And so, you know, it's an uncomfortable situation when our tax base, our property tax base is the main source of income, but they don't want to pay more for, you know, it's unfair. It's literally unfair to ask for half of the population that lives, I don't know, whatever the land base is, as the source of income, to increase that to pay for the services for everybody else. Not everyone else has the opportunity to own land, to own their house, and the current rate of whatever the interest is and whatever else, the cost of education, everything is more expensive. And so we're just trying our best to develop a funding mechanism to alleviate the financial pressure. So, Mr. Olson, that's kind of what I was trying to think, because I share the same kind of thing. I mean, there's a different analysis with some of the people have to deal with. So it's an unfortunate circumstance that we're in, but we're handcuffed because we have this conservative mindset about trying to save money for the property owners, but we want everybody else to come and visit us, but we want to make sure that they get quality services when they come here.
Yes, sir. Mr. Helwig?
I would like to make a motion that we go forward, as you had mentioned earlier, that we're not actually saying we're gonna do the loan right now, but for Mr. Hoff to do what he needs to do.
So motion then to approve this initial resolution authorizing debt?
Oh, yes.
Issuance of debt in 2020. Got a motion by Mr. Helwig. Ms. Dennis?
I will second.
Second by Ms. Dennis. Is there any further discussion? Ms. Pettit?
I think the analogy you could possibly use so they would understand our constituents as us being one of the poorest counties in the state, and they might be able to understand it, is that if you have a house, like Mr. Schlender, Chairman Schlender said, or not Chairman, Supervisor Schlender, said that you're taking your equity, and you could do a house refi, and you're taking that money to pay off other bills sooner, so you're not paying the interest rate on it. Correct?
Thank you.
That's
Ms. Pettit,
something
yes.
they would understand.
Okay, so I have a motion by Mr. Helwig, second by Ms. Dennis, to approve Sawyer County Board of Supervisors' initial resolution authorizing issuance of debt in the 2021 annual budget. Would you like a roll call?
Do whatever you'd like.
Okay.
That'd be good.
Is there any further discussion? Are you good, Mr. Howard?
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. I could. Carol, let's, no further discussion, and we'll call for a roll call vote. Carol, please.
Okay, we start with Mr. Schlender.
Yes.
Helwig. Yes. Duffy. Yes. Paulson.
Yes.
Susie Taylor is absent. Chuck Van Etten.
Yes.
Dale Olson.
Yes.
Don Pettit. Yes. Ron Kinsley. Ron Buckles.
Yes.
Helen Dennis. Dale Schleter. Jesse Betcher is absent. Tweed Schuman.
Yes.
Troy Morgan.
Yes.
Okay,
13.
motion carries. Unanimous. Thank you, Finance Committee. Mr. Paulson, do you have anything else?
No. Yes, I do. On the Finance Committee, the Finance Committee discussed the second courtroom, second large courtroom, and we're going to have to borrow the money to fund that second courtroom. If the county board approves it, it takes a 75% vote to approve the debt, and Mr. Hoff is working to engage a fiscal or financial planner to help us with the debt issuance.
Do we need a motion to that effect?
No, not on the agenda. We're just information only. It'll be coming, Mr. Slender. All right, thank you. Mr. Helwig.
What was your question? A motion for what?
No, it's not.
But
Not on the
I-
agenda. It was just information for the Finance Committee on what's coming forward.
Okay, I was gonna ask, Mr. Van Etten brought up earlier, remember I
Yes.
asked this question, I was out of order?
Yes.
He had mentioned, do we need a vote or whatever to actually say, yes, we're going to build the courthouse? The addition.
We're going to select an option next meeting.
Why?
Yep,
Yeah.
we will. Okay. Yep. All right, we're gonna move on to number 17, okay? 'Cause it's, and this is Administration Committee met last Thursday, and we had much discussion on the Fifth Street option for the second courthouse. We also did a board policy procedure amendment, which is our action item today, which is to suspend Rule 2, subsection 10 for 1 year. Now, it's in your notes here, and that reads that we are no longer limiting the number of meetings a supervisor can attend virtually. So we're taking Rule 2, subsection 10, suspending it for 1 year. Oh, Mr.
Make a motion
Slender.
to do that.
Motion by Mr. Schlender, second by Ms. Pettit to approve the admin committee motion that we suspend rule number 2, subsection 10 for 1 year, and we'll revisit it at that time. Is there any further discussion? If none, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Motion carries. County Administrator's Report, Mr. Hoff.
Yes, thank you. I put in a report of just some highlighted areas. I didn't have a lot of text behind that, but I'll bring up a couple of points here. The COVID response, we had talked previously about local health orders and the enforcement thereof. And we had presented or thought about an ordinance that clarified that enforcement authority on the local level. As I mentioned before, the WCA has put together a study group to look at that statutory or the Supreme Court order that came through and analyzing that and deciding on how best counties and local health officers can enforce the things that are under their authority. So we're going to see something come from that group probably in a month or so, and we'll be looking out for that. We did get a sales tax report on The changes in sales tax this year as compared to last year, it doesn't look too bad yet, but we anticipate the summer months, we may see a slowdown in that sales activity, and factoring that into how we plan the rest of the year as well. We had talked about a lot about the budget. One of the things that Mr. Paulson alluded to was the hiring of a financial advisor. We are also talking with one on doing a cash flow analysis for us that would help identify some of those cash flow issues for us as well, and also give more credence to the situation that we're in to help the explanation of why we're doing what we're doing. And I do appreciate the thoughts and discussion that we had tonight on the issuance of debt situation. This is the first time that you've heard that, other than, some of the finance committee members. And it's a newer concept for you, and we'll be talking about, how we go forward with that as we move through the committee meetings about the budget, looking at that November date. So you're going to have plenty of opportunities over the next few months to talk more about that, what it means, what you want to do, your options that are available, whether it be to issue, that debt, or, the service levels that you're comfortable with. The issuance of debt does increase taxes. That is a fact. And that's a fact that you'll, have to talk to your constituents about. But to provide the services that we're providing now, that's what it's going to cost. And if, you make an option of not funding them to that level, that's certainly your prerogative as well. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to learn more about this, get your questions answered. So if you're not comfortable with it today, certainly think about what your questions are, and we can make sure that we get those answers to you. So thank you for that, and I'll wrap that up. That's my report.
Any questions for Tom? If not, any other matters for discussion only? Mr. Schlender.
All right, so this is the opportunity to address the question that Supervisor Van Etten raised, Mr. Supervisor Hellwig has raised. I think we need to put on the agenda specifically the question of whether or not we're going to build a courtroom. We keep talking about options. We keep talking about, what color it's going to be, what day of the week it's going to be running, who's going to be in it, who's going to use it, who's not going to use it, what we're going to do about it. We need to we're either going to go to the game or we're not. And I think that question needs to be put on there. It needs to be clearly stated. There's a resolution that came from this same body in 2017 saying we support the second courtroom or second judge. Well, now we need to support the idea of a second courtroom. And the implicit idea that, well, if we're discussing options, then we're moving along with those lines, doesn't cut it. We're either going to do this or we're not going to do this. We were told, we were given committee assignments to come back with recommendations. We made all of those recommendations. We still can't come to a decision. I ask that this issue specifically, the single question, do we want to build a second courthouse, be put on the agenda for a vote, up or down, and then we go on to the next thing after that.
Ms. Pettit, you had your light on.
You can go.
Real quick question, or not, no statement. The reason that I mentioned that and like go along with is I think we should have that vote before we select an option. Kind of makes sense to me.
Thank you. Mr. Buckholz.
That's what I've been trying to do ever since I made a motion to send this to the referendum, is to get things going on this friggin' courthouse. But everything keeps going on and on and on. We are gonna build the courthouse. We're just not sure which one we're gonna build yet. I don't know, it just keeps going more and more and more and more. Yes, I say we're gonna build it. You say it? Yes, because that's why we're doing all what we're doing. If we're not gonna build this thing and you wanna save money, let's go back when we did it in 2017 and rescind this whole thing, then we're done with it. You save money, you won't have to worry about no borrowing nothing.
Thank you, Mr. Buckholz. Ms. Pettit.
I understand where Mr. Buckholz stands, but there's members on this board that were elected and we were not here in 2017, and it's before us now, and you're looking at borrowing from capita to meet our budget cost, and then you want to turn around and you have people that are staffed here, again, with the judges at 1.5, and we got to build bring the second judge in and build the courthouse at anywhere from 4 million to 15 million if you go with option 3, but you're not staffing the employees here or the departments fully. They're understaffed, but we're going to then go spend $4 to $15 million on a courthouse, and we're borrowing to meet our budget. Does that, in anybody's head, does that sound okay?
Okay,
That it's not, and then to say that we don't have a vote, that's ridiculous.
Thank you, Ms. Pettis. Ms. Dennis?
Mr. Hoff,
Discussion only.
have our directors, our employees come to you and said, we can't do our job because we're understaffed?
Yeah, we,
Can I discuss that?
Yeah.
It's okay. Go ahead, Ms. Schaaf.
yeah, I recently met with all the departments, and we do this every year, obviously, and there are requests for additional staff, and we can't afford that. So there are departments that have areas that are understaffed, yes. And those are known.
Okay. We are adjourned. Thank you all.
Oh, no.
Appreciate it.
I have, there was the issue with the Supreme Court with the judge about Facebook. Are we going to discuss that at any length about our sitting judge and cases, or with Facebook friends? Does anybody hear about this?
We'll talk about that later. We're adjourned. Done.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
We need some signatures on the proclamation.